The evening sun had slipped behind the gables of East Whitford long before Inspector Purbright arrived at St. Augustine's. The church stood empty, save for the faint echo of footsteps across stone floors and the hush of wind threading through the stained-glass windows. The vicar, a man of nervous courtesy and habitual apologies, met him at the porch. "Inspector," he said, inclining his head in that precise angle reserved for clerical introductions. "Thank you for coming so promptly. I fear an irregularity has presented itself." Purbright, accustomed to such euphemistic phrasing, made no comment but followed the vicar into the nave. The scent of candle wax mingled with the faintly sour aroma of old hymnals. The air carried a gentle stiffness, as though it had absorbed the moral proprieties of generations. A few late parishioners shuffled into the pews, nodding with a careful deliberation that seemed almost a performance. "It is a small matter," the vicar continued, his voice pitched in the polite tremor of embarrassment. "But the confession box, a note, one entrusted to my care, has vanished." He lowered his voice further, as if the confession itself were now a living embarrassment. It is most irregular." Purbright considered the vicar with a measured glance. The man was not inherently deceitful. He simply carried a conscience that trembled under the weight of village scrutiny. "Vanished, you say?" Purbright inquired, his tone precise and calm. "And no one has admitted to handling it?" "None," the vicar replied, fingers tightening around the edges of his surplice. "I have checked the ledger, the drawer, and the vestry. Every corner in which a conscientious clergyman might, in which one would naturally store a document. It is, quite simply, absent." He paused, lowering his voice further still, as though even the stone walls were eager to overhear. "And I am anxious, Inspector. The parish is sensitive. The letters, the notes, the weekly newsletters, they create a delicate lattice of expectations. A misstep, and reputations may falter." Purbright's gaze drifted toward the pews, noting the subtle stiffening of posture, the brief avoidance of eye contact. The latecomers murmured greetings to one another in careful tones, polite but hinting at private knowledge. The village had long since perfected the art of social surveillance. Small gestures, cryptic nods, and the strategic cough were all woven into the fabric of civility. He inclined his head, signaling understanding rather than impatience. "And yet the content of the note is what, exactly?" "Private," the vicar said, with a slight quaver in his intonation. "But the principle remains. It is the principle. One cannot allow such matters to drift into circulation. Even the suggestion of impropriety—" He left the phrase unfinished, for it carried too much weight to articulate fully. Purbright allowed a moment of silence, letting the vicar's anxiety settle into the stone walls. He did not find it unpleasing, for there was often much to be learned in what a man left unspoken. "I shall inquire," he said finally, with the soft weight of authority. "We will proceed with discretion." The vicar nodded, a small flush colouring his temples. They moved toward the vestry, stepping softly over the worn stones. Purbright noted the arrangement of objects: hymnals lined with obsessive precision, a brass candelabrum slightly askew, a lectern polished until it reflected the dim glow of candlelight. Nothing seemed amiss, and yet a trained eye discerned subtle signs of disturbance. The vestry keys lay not in their usual hook, the ledger slightly open at a page that bore no immediately relevant annotation, a scrap of paper, too small, too neatly folded, tucked between hymnals. "The parish committee meets tomorrow evening," the vicar murmured, as if speaking to himself. "They shall have their suspicions. And the newsletter? God forbid they speculate prematurely." Purbright did not comment. He noted only the rhythm of speech, the slight hesitation before certain words, the carefully calculated pace of disclosure. It was, he thought, a village in miniature, each gesture, each avoidance, each polite disclaimer, a reflection of a community's anxious desire to maintain order. Tea was offered in the vicarage parlour, a formal tea with silver spoons lined in precise symmetry, biscuits placed with deliberate distance. Purbright accepted a cup without ceremony, observing the careful choreography of domestic life. The housekeeper moved with quiet efficiency, yet her eyes lingered a moment too long on the ledger, a faint tension betraying her otherwise serene countenance. The vicar poured himself a cup of tea, murmuring about the inconvenience of lost documents, the vulnerability of reputation, and the perils of gossip. "One imagines," he said, carefully choosing his words, "that even a minor lapse might cast a shadow over a parishioner's name. It is the village, Inspector, the village that magnifies the smallest pebble into a boulder." Purbright sipped his tea, noting the absence of heat in the parlour, despite the coal fire's polite glow. "It seems," he said, "that the missing note has significance beyond its mere contents. It is a symbol of propriety under threat." "Precisely." The vicar's relief at recognition was almost audible. "And the committee, well, they will ask questions. Everyone will ask questions." Silence settled, as though the room itself was listening. The housekeeper cleared her throat and moved toward the door, the soft click of her shoes punctuating the otherwise quiet room. Purbright noted, without outward comment, that her movements were deliberate, rehearsed even, as though she feared misstep as much as the vicar feared gossip. After a few moments, Purbright rose, setting down his cup. "I shall begin with the vestry records and parish communications," he said, "and I may wish to speak with a few of the committee members discreetly." The vicar inclined his head as if the inspector's statement was simultaneously reassuring and alarming. "I shall leave them entirely to your discretion. I trust your judgment." As they returned to the church, Purbright's attention wandered to the congregation still dispersing. He noticed a widow in the corner, fingering the edge of her muff, her eyes momentarily meeting his before dropping to the floor. The parish organist lingered by the choir stall, humming softly under her breath, a tune slightly at odds with the rest of the service. The sexton moved among the pews with punctilious care, ensuring each hymn book was returned to proper alignment. In these small actions, Purbright detected the faintest traces of anxiety, of consciousness directed toward the missing note, of loyalty and fear, and perhaps something more, calculating interest. Each movement, polite yet measured, created a lattice of silent communication that he would need to unravel. The vicar paused before the confession box, brushing his hand lightly over the polished wood. "I suppose," he said, "that we must hope it was merely misplaced. Yet—" His voice trailed, carrying both apology and apprehension. Purbright bent slightly, inspecting the surrounding pews and floor. He noted a faint indentation on the carpet, where the box might have been shifted, and a tiny scrap of paper curling at the edge beneath a hymn book. He pocketed it discreetly, noting the irregularity without overt remark. "Vespers conclude, and yet questions remain," he murmured to himself, in that quiet, deliberate way of his. The parishioners were leaving now, each nodding politely, murmuring soft farewells, carrying with them their anxieties and small triumphs alike. The inspector straightened. The missing confession might have vanished in the literal sense, but the residue of its absence was tangible. Subtle glances, tentative speech, and the faint rustle of sheets in the vestry. And somewhere within this lattice of civility and quiet suspicion lay the first clue, modest and almost invisible, yet enough to set his inquiries in motion. A shadow shifted near the back pew, and Purbright, with the faintest twitch of his lips, noted the almost imperceptible tightening of a hand around a prayer book. Something had been observed, or perhaps concealed, and the inspector understood immediately that East Whitford had begun its slow, careful negotiation with truth. He turned to the vicar. "We shall proceed," he said, quietly. And as he did, he allowed himself the smallest measure of dry amusement at the perfection of polite anxiety. In East Whitford, the ripples of suspicion were far more interesting than the waves of confession itself. Inspector Purbright found himself the next morning in the modestly appointed sitting-room of Mrs. Hargreaves, whose genteel air of officious hospitality had been the subject of several parish whispers. The room smelled faintly of lavender polish and old paper. Books lined the shelves in orderly, almost ostentatious rows. On the mantelpiece, a scattering of letters in neat piles suggested both diligence and a subtle eagerness to display propriety. Some were unopened, their envelopes creased with careful deliberation. Others bore the smudged traces of ink that hinted at hurried penmanship, perhaps composed under mild duress. Mrs. Hargreaves, herself a woman of precise habits and polite suspicion, welcomed Purbright with the air of someone performing a socially obligatory ritual. "Inspector," she began, her voice crisp with unspoken authority, "I trust you are well. Pray, sit. I was about to arrange the correspondence for the month." Her eyes flicked to the letters as though they were modest witnesses to her propriety. "One must keep such things in order." "Disorder," she added softly, "breeds scandal." Purbright, seated across from her, allowed a faint smile. He observed the subtle tremor in her hand as she adjusted a particularly tidy stack of envelopes. "Certainly," he said, "the maintenance of order is, in its own way, a moral obligation." Mrs. Hargreaves inclined her head with satisfaction. "Indeed. And letters, Inspector, are the lifeblood of the village. One misdelivered note, or even a misunderstood phrase, can ripple across social circles like a minor epidemic." She paused, arranging a bundle of invitations in ascending order of importance, measured by the social prominence of their recipients. "It is regrettably a responsibility not all undertake with sufficient care." Purbright's gaze swept the room with careful impartiality, noting that the display of letters was more than mere housekeeping. The arrangement spoke of hierarchy, of hidden allegiances, and perhaps of the occasional private reproof. Even in the mundane act of sorting correspondence, the subtleties of village politics were manifest. The prioritization of certain names, the slight turn of envelopes to obscure recipients, and the gentle avoidance of those whose presence, or absence, could provoke embarrassment. "You will forgive me, Inspector," Mrs. Hargreaves continued, "but the disappearance of a confession note has, I fear, unsettled the equilibrium of our little community." Her eyes, briefly narrowing, conveyed both concern and a subtle insistence that she had personally safeguarded propriety. "I have no doubt," she added, "that the vicar was meticulous, but one can never be certain. Clerics are human, as you know." Purbright inclined his head slightly. "I am aware, and yet it is often the human element, the oversight, the hesitation, the polite concealment that offers the clearest insight." Mrs. Hargreaves pursed her lips, and for a moment the faintest shadow passed over her expression. She carefully selected a letter from the top of a stack and examined it with meticulous attention. "This arrived yesterday," she said, handing it to Purbright, "from a committee member who wishes to remain anonymous. They write of minor grievances, financial discrepancies, and the occasional breach of decorum. All trivial, yet they are the whispers of the community, small tremors that reveal the shape of conscience." Purbright scanned the letter, noting the elaborate circumlocution, employed to veil both complaint and accusation. The writer had invested great effort in preserving civility while subtly indicting neighbours. It was, he thought, an excellent example of East Whitford's prevailing social economy, critique and protection enmeshed in equal measure. "Fascinating," he murmured. "One might say that civility itself has become a mask for vigilance." Mrs. Hargreaves gave a thin smile, acknowledging without comment the inspector's wry observation. She poured tea with deliberate precision, the spoon clinking softly against the porcelain, the aroma of Earl Grey mingling with the faint trace of ink. "It is not merely vigilance, Inspector, but the management of reputation. In our village, appearances are a currency as vital as coin. A minor indiscretion," she added, gesturing vaguely toward the mantelpiece, "can be more costly than any fiscal debt." As they sipped their tea, Purbright allowed his attention to roam over the room's details. A photograph of the parish committee hung on the wall, each member smiling with calculated geniality, eyes bright with courtesy. On the sideboard, a ledger lay open, its entries neat, yet revealing subtle inconsistencies, dates that seemed improbable, sums slightly rounded, initials slightly altered. Small, perhaps, but enough to suggest minor perturbations in the otherwise orderly social lattice. "You see," Mrs. Hargreaves continued, settling into her chair with measured grace, "it is the small things that reveal character. A misplaced note, a tardy reply, a slight hesitation in conversation. These are the true indicators of intention. One learns to read them as one would read scripture." Purbright nodded thoughtfully, noting the faint tension in her posture. It was not merely a matter of gossip or idle curiosity. There was anxiety here, a desire to preserve both personal and communal integrity. Even the act of mentioning the missing confession had been carefully modulated, hedged with euphemism and polite disavowal. He made a mental note of the meticulousness, as small clues were often best concealed within the ordinary. A sudden knock at the door interrupted the rhythm of their observation. A young man, the vicar's nephew, and occasional messenger, entered with a polite bow. In his hand he carried a small envelope, addressed in a hurried but legible script. "From the post, ma'am," he said, placing it gently on the mantelpiece before retreating without further comment. The envelope bore no return address, yet its arrival carried a subtle charge, a whisper of something previously unknown. Mrs. Hargreaves examined it with a faint tremor of curiosity, then handed it to Purbright. He observed the seal, intact, yet faintly irregular, as if pressed in haste. Slipping a finger beneath the flap, he extracted the note, careful not to disturb its contents prematurely. A few words written in a delicate, almost self-conscious hand mentioned a meeting at the vicarage and a passing reference to a mislaid responsibility. Though opaque, the phrasing suggested both knowledge and discretion. "The post," Mrs. Hargreaves said softly, "is of course impartial, but it carries intentions as well as messages. One learns to read them carefully." Her eyes, sharp and assessing, flicked to the inspector. "Do you find, Inspector, that the content of correspondence can reveal more than the author intends?" Purbright allowed himself a faint, dry smile. "In East Whitford," he replied, "even a seemingly neutral letter is never neutral. One observes omissions as carefully as inclusions." The conversation paused, and the two sat in companionable silence, each aware of the subtle social landscape that surrounded them, letters, ledgers, and the invisible lattice of reputational concern. Purbright noticed a small crease at the corner of the envelope he had opened, a faint fingerprint perhaps, or a trace of hurried handling. Something small and easily overlooked, yet indicative of a human hand moved by necessity or apprehension. Mrs. Hargreaves rose to fetch another tray of biscuits, and Purbright's gaze lingered on the mantelpiece once more. Each stack of correspondence, each carefully positioned envelope, seemed almost to breathe with the unspoken anxieties of the village. In their arrangement were hints of alliances, minor resentments, and the cautious exercise of discretion. The missing confession note, he thought, had not simply vanished. It had been absorbed into a lattice of social caution, manoeuvred perhaps with the very same delicacy Mrs. Hargreaves applied to her correspondence. As he prepared to take his leave, a subtle sound drew his attention, a faint rustle behind the mantelpiece, barely audible above the ticking of the clock. It was not a noise to provoke alarm, merely a suggestion that something or someone had moved where they should not have. Purbright, with the smallest of nods, noted the anomaly and allowed his mind to catalogue it as another piece of the village's intricate puzzle. Outside, the morning sun broke through intermittent clouds, casting long shadows over cobbled streets. Purbright observed the orderly facades, the faintly prim gardens, the careful distance maintained between neighbours. Within this superficial calm, he sensed the faintest tremor, an undercurrent of knowledge, observation, and withheld confession, moving like a quiet current beneath the village's polite exterior. It was, he thought with restrained amusement, precisely the sort of place where a confession could vanish and yet leave its ghost in every gesture, every letter, every measured glance, and perhaps, just perhaps, one of those letters or one of those glances would offer the first real clue to its disappearance. With that silent question lingering, Purbright lifted his hat to Mrs. Hargreaves, nodded politely, and stepped into the street. The village, orderly and precise, continued its cautious performance, and the inspector, as ever, observed with gentle scrutiny, aware that small details, most unremarkable to the casual eye, were the currency of discovery. The parish committee convened in the small, oak-panelled room above the village hall, where polished wood and patterned wallpaper lent a sense of importance to discussions that were, in reality, minor and delicately managed. Inspector Purbright arrived punctually, noting the subtle choreography of civility that preceded any formal meeting, the secretary arranging papers with almost obsessive care, the treasurer adjusting spectacles in a measured, habitual gesture, and the chairman straightening his tie as if that alone could straighten the moral fibres of the parish. "Inspector Purbright," the chairman said, inclining his head with precise courtesy, "we are gratified by your attendance. It is, regrettably, in matters of propriety that we find ourselves compelled to consult you." His tone was gentle, yet carried the weight of a man who considered rumour and reputation to be almost interchangeable. Purbright accepted the polite acknowledgment with a slight nod. "I understand the nature of your concerns," he replied evenly, scanning the room. Each member's posture conveyed a careful balance between openness and guardedness, a dance that the inspector had come to recognize as a vital form of village communication. Even the windows, shuttered against a mild drizzle, seemed to frame the meeting in a metaphorical containment of discretion. The secretary, a woman of precise habits and faintly stiff expression, distributed the agenda with a mechanical grace. "Minutes of the previous meeting, accounts, charity subscriptions," she intoned. "Any other matters for consideration may be introduced under correspondence." Her eyes flicked briefly to Purbright, as though to judge whether he would interpret these formalities literally or read between the lines. "The matter of the vicar's lost confession note," said the treasurer, whose careful enunciation suggested both reluctance and self-importance, "has caused some concern. Not that any particular malfeasance is suspected, of course, but the very absence of documentation is disconcerting." He tapped the ledger with a fingernail, an almost imperceptible tremor betraying his own unease. Purbright's gaze lingered on the treasurer. Indeed, absence, in matters of record and reputation alike, often carries weight out of proportion to the matter itself. His phrasing was deliberate, formal, and lightly ironic, a subtle signal that he observed more than he stated. The discussion proceeded with careful circumlocution. Committee members spoke of minor grievances, of delayed subscriptions and forgotten deliveries, each phrased as if admitting a single failing might unravel their entire social standing. Even references to the missing note were cloaked in euphemism, described as a clerical oversight, or momentary misplacement. Purbright noted the pattern. The louder the insistence of innocence, the more likely it concealed attentive observation, a subtle manipulation of perception. During a pause for tea, brought in by a deputized member, whose hands trembled only slightly, Purbright allowed himself a discreet survey of the room. The china cups, mismatched yet polished, reflected a care for appearances that mirrored the meticulousness of conversation. Mrs. Pendlebury, a committee member of advanced years and habitual prevarication, whispered something to her neighbour, whose polite nod suggested either assent or the delicate acknowledgement of shared suspicion. Every gesture, every nuance seemed to serve two purposes: outward civility and inward calculation. "Perhaps we may turn to the question of subscriptions," said the chairman, his voice measured, as if the very phrase contained a moral imperative. "Some have been tardy, though I am confident there are reasonable explanations." He allowed a small, almost imperceptible pause, and Purbright observed the glances exchanged among the members. The unspoken calculus was evident. A late subscription might be explained, but a lapse in decorum, however minor, might not be forgiven. Purbright cleared his throat softly. "I would be obliged to hear, with discretion, whether any member has observed circumstances surrounding the vicar's note that might assist in understanding its disappearance." His tone suggested inquiry without accusation, observation without imposition. A brief silence followed, punctuated only by the polite clink of spoons against porcelain and the occasional shuffle of papers. Then carefully Mrs. Pendlebury ventured, Well, it has come to my attention only in passing that the vicar appeared unusually harried the evening the note was to be placed in the box. I do not mean to imply negligence, merely perturbation." Her hands tightened around her cup. Perhaps he misplaced something in his diligence. Or perhaps, Purbright allowed himself a faint, dry smile. The note was removed deliberately with the same discretion that guides all careful misplacement. The room's subtle rustle suggested awareness, even mild unease. Another member, Mr. Carroway, leaned forward, fingers interlaced. "I observed nothing, save that the vicar did linger longer than usual in the vestry. That is all. I am confident it was merely routine oversight." Yet his eyes flickered toward the ledger, with a nervous precision betraying a consciousness of what might otherwise remain unspoken. Purbright noted, as he had in so many villages, that those who protested the most vigorously against impropriety were often the most alert to its presence. The room, impeccably ordered yet brimming with quiet tension, carried an almost tangible anticipation, as if the missing note were both absent and omnipresent, influencing every polite gesture, every careful phrase. Tea concluded, the chairman returned to the agenda with deliberate composure, and the inspector observed the minutiae of behaviour, the secretary adjusting her spectacles, the treasurer counting change for the tea donation with exaggerated care, Mrs. Pendlebury smoothing the edge of her handkerchief, each act a minor signal in the lattice of suspicion and reputation. Purbright allowed himself a moment to consider the ledger, which lay open before the treasurer. Entries were meticulously precise, yet the faint misalignment of columns suggested either distraction or an attempt to conceal minor discrepancies. The inspector made a quiet note of this in his mind. The pattern of deliberate oversight was almost as telling as overt misconduct. "You understand, Inspector," the chairman said quietly. "We are a community bound by duty as well as by civility. One hopes to maintain order, yet one must acknowledge that human error and occasionally human cunning cannot be entirely prevented." "Indeed," Purbright said softly. "And in such cases even a trivial lapse can propagate far beyond its initial occurrence, rippling through perception and expectation alike." His tone carried neither accusation nor judgment, only observation. A subtle change in Mrs. Pendlebury's posture caught his attention. She had been arranging the papers on the table, aligning them with fastidious care, yet now her hand hovered over one particular stack. A faint crease, almost imperceptible, marked the corner of a sheet she seemed reluctant to disclose. Purbright's gaze met hers, and though no words were exchanged, a silent dialogue of awareness passed between them. The note, or a fragment of its consequence, seemed to hover in that crease, a minor but significant clue in the invisible architecture of village propriety. As the meeting concluded and the members prepared to leave, each offering carefully measured nods and whispered pleasantries, Purbright lingered at the table, his eyes on the ledger and the faintly creased sheet. The village's carefully constructed lattice of civility had begun to reveal the faintest anomalies, a hesitation, a misplaced gesture, an unspoken knowledge of what was absent yet deeply felt. The treasurer, departing last, paused and adjusted the ledger, leaving the inspector with a sense that this too was deliberate, a minor performance of propriety masking awareness of events perhaps better left unspoken. Purbright allowed himself a quiet moment of wry amusement. In East Whitford, morality was a currency more tightly regulated than coin, and every gesture, every whisper, carried weight. Outside, the drizzle had ceased, leaving the cobbled streets damp and glistening under a muted sun. Purbright observed the orderly facades of the houses, the carefully tended gardens, the soft murmur of neighbours acknowledging one another at a measured distance. Beneath the surface, calm, subtle tremors moved, an awareness of observation, a quiet accounting of loyalty and discretion, and, most intriguingly, the faintly visible crease on a committee sheet that might yet reveal the first tangible clue to the missing confession. With this observation lingering in his mind, Purbright allowed himself the slightest of smiles. The village's civility remained intact, yet the smallest disruptions, hesitation, misaligned ledger entries, creased paper, suggested that the lattice of propriety was quietly fraying. And somewhere, hidden in the folds of ink and etiquette, the inspector sensed the first step toward discovery. The morning air carried a faint chill as Inspector Purbright arrived at the vicarage to observe the domestic routines, curious whether the humdrum cadence of household life might conceal something more telling than any overt confession. The vicar's residence, modest in scale but precise in appearance, betrayed the subtle anxieties of its occupants. Windows polished to the point of reflecting concern, draperies drawn with meticulous care, and carpets arranged with the faintest hint of geometric precision. Purbright was greeted by the housekeeper, a woman of composed efficiency, whose gloved hands moved with deliberate intent over the silver tray of morning tea. She offered no comment, though her eyes, sharp, observant, lingered momentarily on the inspector, as if assessing whether he would notice the slight disarray in the vicar's papers. "Good morning, Inspector," she said finally, in that restrained tone that marked every utterance with implied oversight. "The vicar is occupied with correspondence, but he will be pleased to know you have arrived." Purbright inclined his head and allowed himself a quiet survey of the room. Teacups were placed with almost ritualistic care, biscuits arranged in symmetric rows, and the morning ledger lay open, though the entries were oddly misaligned. The irregularity was subtle, an overlong space here, a fractionally crooked line there, as if the hand of the author had hesitated. Small deviations, he knew, could signify much when handled with the etiquette of East Whitford. The vicar appeared shortly, smoothing his jacket, eyes slightly troubled, but masked with habitual civility. "Inspector," he said, offering a hand, "I trust your morning has been tolerably agreeable." There was, in the phrasing, the faint tremor of a man already burdened with minor anxieties. Purbright allowed a polite smile. "I find mornings such as this offer the clearest view of character," he said. His glance fell on the footman, a young man standing stiffly by the doorway, polishing a tray with a precision that was almost aggressive in its attention. Even in routine, patterns emerge. The footman, Edward, nodded curtly, lips pressed in a line. His movements were careful, but Purbright noted a tremor in the way he handled the silver, as though the slightest slip might invite censure, or worse, suspicion. He had watched enough domestic staff in small villages to recognize this subtle performance, a combination of obedience, fear, and carefully moderated independence. "Edward," the vicar said, "the inspector is examining the parish correspondence. Perhaps you might assist if convenient." The footman's eyes flickered, briefly betraying unease before he inclined his head. "Certainly, sir." His voice was soft, controlled, yet Purbright observed the fraction of hesitation, the almost imperceptible twitch in his right hand, the careful spacing of his words. In East Whitford, such small tells could be as illuminating as the most detailed ledger. Purbright allowed him to organize letters and notes, his own gaze lingering on the minor inconsistencies. Envelopes slightly mismatched, postmarks that did not correspond to the recorded arrival date, and the faint trace of a hastily folded scrap tucked behind a larger bundle. Each irregularity suggested either distraction or deliberate obfuscation. The inspector's task was to determine which. "Did anyone enter the vestry yesterday?" Purbright inquired, in the tone reserved for casual observation rather than interrogation. The footman's head lowered fractionally. "Only the vicar, sir, and the housekeeper, briefly." His voice was careful, his posture taut. A hesitation, almost invisible, suggested either concealment or the mere weight of over-politeness. Purbright's eyes rested on the footman for a few more seconds, allowing the silence to perform part of his inquiry. The young man's attention returned, hands steadying, as if the lapse had been corrected and the impropriety, real or imagined, contained. "Would you mind," Purbright continued, "retrieving the ledger from the vestry?" The request was casual, the phrasing light, yet deliberate in the hope of observing his manner in handling something potentially sensitive. Edward moved toward the vestry, his footsteps measured. The door closed with a soft click, and Purbright's eyes lingered on the remaining household staff. The housekeeper adjusted a tray, her back stiff, her hands precise, though the faintest flicker of concern passed over her features as though the footman's movement had awakened some latent awareness. Minutes later, Edward returned with the ledger, laying it on the table with careful precision. Purbright noted the slight crease at one corner of a page, evidence of repeated handling. It was unremarkable to an untrained observer, but in the subtle economy of East Whitford, it was a signpost, a trace of human attention, a hint of interference, perhaps even a fragment of knowledge withheld. "I notice," Purbright said, turning the pages with deliberate slowness, "that certain entries here are aligned differently than the majority. Perhaps mere oversight, or perhaps a minor recalibration of appearance." His tone carried the lightest of ironies, the sort of gentle wit that invited confession without coercion. The housekeeper's gaze, flicked briefly to the ledger, then to Edward, who remained vigilant but slightly tense. Neither spoke, yet Purbright detected the careful balance of discretion, loyalty, and anxiety. In East Whitford, silence often spoke louder than words, and the inspector was attuned to these subtleties. He allowed a pause before continuing. "And the correspondence? Anything received or delivered in haste yesterday?" Edward's lips pressed together for a fraction longer than required. "A few letters, sir. Nothing of particular import, I believe. The vicar directed me to place them in order for the committee." Again, a tremor in phrasing suggested self-consciousness. Perhaps the young man was merely conscientious, or perhaps he had observed something he deemed unworthy of mention. Purbright sipped his tea, noting the faint irregularity in the sequence of arrivals. "One must always attend to what is absent as well as what is present," he said. "Omissions are a language of their own." As the inspector examined the ledger and the surrounding correspondence, his eyes caught a small, folded note, partially hidden beneath the vicar's ink blotter. Its edge was slightly frayed, and the fold had been pressed with care. Purbright picked it up, noting the careful, almost hesitant handwriting, a few words, elusive and indirect, hinting at awareness of the confession's disappearance. It was neither accusatory nor revealing, merely suggestive, a quiet gesture of knowledge, perhaps intended for the wrong eyes, or perhaps left inadvertently. The vicar cleared his throat, as if sensing the movement of the note. "Inspector, I do hope nothing in the household has given cause for concern. We are, after all, a community of shared responsibility." His eyes flicked to Edward, whose hands rested lightly on the table, betraying the slightest tension. Purbright inclined his head. "I am merely observing, sir. Observation alone often provides the most reliable testimony." His gaze lingered on Edward, noting the young man's precise control of posture and gesture, a balance of obedience and reticence that spoke more eloquently than speech. The housekeeper moved to refill the tea, her eyes briefly meeting the inspector's. There was an unspoken acknowledgement, a silent question hovering between them. Had the footman, in his minor and ostensibly routine duties, witnessed or even participated in the careful disappearance of the confession? Or was this crease in the note merely the product of overzealous care? Purbright placed the folded paper carefully in his pocket, making no sign of its significance. He understood that in East Whitford, the act of noticing was itself a form of subtle influence, a quiet assertion of awareness, a soft challenge to the web of discretion that governed all social interactions. As he prepared to leave, he allowed his gaze to wander over the room one last time. The vicar was arranging correspondence with precise diligence. The housekeeper moved with the same composed efficiency. Edward, the footman, lingered at the doorway, his posture taut but controlled. All three were actors in the same intricate tableau, each performing propriety while concealing concern or knowledge, or perhaps both. Purbright stepped onto the damp morning path, noting the faint impression of hurried footsteps in the soft soil outside the vicarage. A minor trace, easily overlooked, yet suggestive. He walked on, silent and deliberate, carrying the folded scrap of paper in his coat pocket. In it he recognized a subtle shift, a sign that the confession, though physically absent, had left its first tangible ripple in the network of observation, loyalty, and minor anxiety that governed the household. In East Whitford, he reflected with a faint, dry amusement, even a note folded in haste could speak volumes. And somewhere in the precise choreography of domestic routine, the first clues of intention were beginning to reveal themselves. The afternoon sun, pale and diffused by a thin veil of cloud, fell across the windows of St. Augustine's as Inspector Purbright arrived for choir practice. The church was quiet, save for the subtle rustle of sheet music and the occasional creak of pews under careful pressure. Even in this routine gathering, social hierarchies were meticulously maintained. Seating was assigned not by habit but by rank, seniority, and the invisible weight of long-standing grudges. The choir director, Miss Langley, a woman of exacting taste and unspoken authority, greeted the inspector with restrained civility. "Inspector Purbright," she said, her voice carrying the faintest quaver of exasperation beneath its formal tone. "We are fortunate to have your observation today, though I hope it will not disrupt our delicate arrangements." Purbright inclined his head politely. "I am here only to observe, Miss Langley. Even the quietest harmonies can reveal discord if one listens attentively." The choir members filed in, adjusting hymnals, tuning voices, and exchanging polite, measured greetings. There was no overt tension, yet the inspector detected the subtle interplay of suspicion and ambition, the soprano casting brief, evaluative glances at the choir master, the tenor whispering remarks to a neighbour quickly suppressed with a faint cough, the alto maintaining a perfect stillness as if her silence alone could assert moral authority. The vicar was present, seated near the organ, his posture stiff with polite engagement. He occasionally lifted his eyes from the hymnals, scanning the faces of his parishioners with careful attention. Purbright noted the slight twitch in his fingers as he adjusted his spectacles, habitual, yet somehow anxious, as if the missing confession remained a tangible weight upon him even in this ordinary gathering. Miss Langley began the practice, her baton raising and lowering with meticulous precision. "Attention to timing," she said softly, "and clarity of expression. Remember, music is as much about discipline as it is about harmony." Her words carried more than instruction. They were a subtle reminder of authority, a reinforcement of order in a room populated by unspoken rivalries. Purbright observed the minor fissures. The choir's first alto, Mrs. Fenton, lingered a fraction too long over her notes, her eyes scanning the congregation area as though seeking validation. The tenor, Mr. Carraway, whispered corrections to his neighbour, who shook her head ever so slightly in disapproval. Even the youngest member, barely able to keep pace, displayed a cautious attentiveness that bordered on anxiety. Each gesture, while outwardly compliant, hinted at private calculations and minor resentments. During a brief pause, the vicar rose and addressed the group. "Your dedication is appreciated," he said, voice tempered by civility. "I trust that all will remember our communal responsibilities, both musical and moral." His gaze lingered, almost imperceptibly, on several members whose hands trembled lightly as they adjusted hymnals or coats. Purbright noted the flicker of concern. Even a small anxiety could, in a village so attentive to propriety, indicate more than mere nervousness. As the practice continued, Purbright allowed himself the quiet amusement of observing the delicate tension between ambition and courtesy. The soprano, Miss Ralston, occasionally emphasized her solo lines with exaggerated clarity, drawing not only attention to her musical skill but also, subtly, to her position in the parish hierarchy. The alto, Mrs. Fenton, responded with the faintest shift in posture, as if to reclaim her moral authority through the smallest, almost imperceptible gesture. Midway through the session, a small sheet of paper fell from the organ bench, drifting silently to the floor near the inspector's feet. He picked it up discreetly, noting the handwriting. Careful, slightly cramped, with marginal notations that suggested both haste and deliberation. The words were innocuous, a reminder of an upcoming rehearsal, but the placement, the fall, and the marginalia all suggested intentionality, a subtle communication within the otherwise disciplined routine. Purbright allowed the paper to remain in his hand, observing reactions without comment. Miss Langley glanced at the organ bench, eyes narrowing slightly, but returned to her conducting as if nothing had occurred. The vicar's attention flicked toward the foot of the bench, then back to his hymnals. No one acknowledged the note, yet the inspector sensed the faint electrical tension of awareness. Someone had noticed, someone had perhaps left it deliberately. Tea followed practice, served in the parish hall with understated formality. Chairs scraped softly against the floor, and cups were arranged with geometric precision. Conversations, while polite, carried the faintest undercurrent of veiled critique, a remark about punctuality, a gentle query regarding contributions to the church fund, a subtle reference to musical competence and propriety. Each comment was phrased to appear innocuous, yet each revealed the careful negotiation of reputation. Purbright allowed the discussion to flow without interruption, noting the smallest cues. The tenor's hand trembled slightly as he lifted his teacup. The soprano's gaze lingered on the vicar's direction, ever alert to minor commendations or criticisms. The organist, Miss Langley's assistant, avoided eye contact with Purbright, yet her hands, folded in her lap, betrayed an almost imperceptible tightness. A remark about the upcoming committee meeting led, inevitably, to a mention of the missing confession note. "I trust," said the soprano, voice light and measured, "that we may all rely upon the vicar's memory and discretion. Our records, after all, are in capable hands." The phrasing was polite, yet the subtext was unmistakable. The matter of propriety was being monitored, each gesture observed, each omission catalogued. Purbright allowed a subtle silence to settle. "It is remarkable," he said softly, "how a single absent document can influence the entire tenor of a community. Even music, which one assumes to be governed solely by rhythm and pitch, reflects the unseen currents of observation and expectation." The conversation paused, and the inspector's eyes wandered across the room. He noted the faint crease in the margin of Miss Langley's hymnals, the irregular alignment of the pew cushions, and a small scrap of paper half hidden beneath the table. It was the kind of minor irregularity that an inattentive eye would overlook. Yet in East Whitford, such details were rarely accidental. The vicar, rising to collect his notes, brushed a hand across the pew as if seeking reassurance from the polished wood. Purbright's attention lingered on the small movements, the gestures of self-protection and social calculation. Even the casual adjustment of a hymn book could conceal awareness, complicity, or minor anxiety. As the choir dispersed, members exchanging measured pleasantries and polite nods, Purbright retained the scrap of paper he had noticed. Its significance was unclear, yet its existence suggested that someone, intentionally or otherwise, had left a trace, a minor clue, in the otherwise seamless performance of communal propriety. The inspector allowed a quiet smile. In East Whitford, he reflected, the most telling movements were often the smallest. A crease in paper, a tremor of hand, a pause in speech. The confession note had vanished, yet its presence, or the awareness of its absence, continued to echo through every measured gesture, every subtle glance, every carefully composed remark. And somewhere, he thought, hidden within the lattice of polite rivalry and attentive observation, lay the first suggestion of who had noticed the note, who had manipulated it, and perhaps in time, who would ultimately be revealed as its custodian. With that unspoken question lingering, Purbright stepped into the damp afternoon, the faintest glimmer of sunlight illuminating cobbled streets. Choir members filed past the church, their expressions composed, yet shadowed with awareness. The inspector adjusted his coat and walked on, carrying both the scrap of paper and the quiet knowledge that in a village governed by civility, even the most minor discord could illuminate a deeper truth. Inspector Purbright returned to the vicarage in the subdued light of mid-morning, intending to examine the parish ledger in greater detail. The vicar's study, lined with books and the faint scent of aged paper, presented a picture of calm diligence. Yet Purbright sensed the underlying tension as soon as he crossed the threshold. The ledger itself lay open on the desk, its bindings slightly worn, entries written in precise, measured script. On the surface, everything appeared orderly. Yet, as in East Whitford one learned early, apparent propriety often concealed small fractures. "Inspector," the vicar began, his voice pitched with polite anxiety, "I trust you have had no difficulty in your observations. The ledger is, I hope, entirely comprehensible." His fingers rested lightly upon the book, as though guarding it from scrutiny. Purbright inclined his head. "Comprehensible, yes. Entirely, perhaps not." He allowed his gaze to travel along the columns of numbers and notes, noting the faint irregularities, sums rounded differently, marginal annotations slightly askew, entries that seemed to correct themselves mid-line. Such deviations, trivial as they appeared, often indicated the careful management of perception. The vicar's lips pressed together. "I can assure you, Inspector, any discrepancies are unintentional. Clerical errors, perhaps, but no impropriety." There was a hesitancy in his voice, a faint tremor betraying the anxiety of one who felt responsible for the moral as well as financial oversight of his parish. Purbright allowed a moment of silence, permitting the ledger to speak through its very precision. "Human error," he observed, "is often most revealing when presented with an air of complete correctness. A misalignment, a marginal note, even a hesitation in recording, can indicate intention rather than oversight." The vicar, though uncertain, nodded. "Indeed. Yet it is difficult to maintain both moral and numerical order simultaneously." He gestured vaguely toward the desk. "One attempts to ensure that accounts reflect the parish's integrity. Sometimes the ledger does not keep pace with reality." Purbright turned a page deliberately, noting a faint crease along the edge, as though the sheet had been folded and unfolded several times. The annotations in the margin were slight, almost invisible, yet carefully placed. "These notations," he said, voice even and calm, "might suggest attention directed elsewhere, or perhaps an attempt to preserve discretion." The vicar's brow furrowed lightly. "It is possible. Certain contributions arrived late. One must adjust entries to maintain clarity, lest misunderstandings arise." His hands rested lightly on the table, betraying a subtle tension beneath the veneer of routine. Purbright allowed himself a faint, dry smile. "Adjustments are rarely neutral. They communicate as much about intention as accuracy. In this ledger, I observe a pattern of minor deviations, each seemingly trivial yet collectively suggestive. It is the management of perception, perhaps even more than the management of sums, that interests me." A soft knock at the door interrupted their observation. The footman entered, bearing a small tray of refreshments, hands steady but posture taut. Edward, as Purbright had come to recognize, moved with care, calculated to display competence while concealing awareness. He set the tray down, eyes briefly flicking toward the ledger, then returned to the doorway. "Thank you, Edward," the vicar said, with a polite tone that seemed both formal and slightly admonitory. The young man inclined his head and departed, leaving the inspector to his reflections. Purbright allowed himself a measured pause. He examined the annotations once more. Small crosses beside certain entries, asterisks that referred to marginal notes, numbers slightly shifted as if to draw attention or avoid scrutiny. Each alteration seemed conscious, deliberate, yet careful to avoid overt implication. Even the most minor correction could serve as a signal to a particular observer, a whisper of intent embedded within routine. "Inspector," the vicar murmured, after a thoughtful silence. "The committee will soon review these records. They have a remarkable ability to discern irregularity, whether or not it exists." He smiled faintly, though the gesture carried unease. "And the parishioners, well, their attention to minor deviations is extraordinary. A single line out of place can provoke gossip for weeks." Purbright nodded slowly. "Order, when observed meticulously, can create its own tension. It signals diligence but also invites scrutiny. The ledger, in its precise management, becomes a social instrument as well as a financial record." Turning a page, Purbright discovered a faintly folded note inserted between two entries. He extracted it discreetly. A brief message, written in a careful hand, indicated that a recent donation had been adjusted to reflect both the donor's intention and the parish's practical constraints. On its face, the note seemed innocuous, yet its placement suggested deliberate concealment, intended to be seen, or perhaps overlooked, by only a particular observer. The vicar, sensing Purbright's attention to the note, murmured, "That is merely a record of a contribution that arrived late. I placed it there to avoid confusion during committee review." His voice carried the faintest tremor, betraying a subtle anxiety over propriety and appearance. Purbright made no comment, instead noting the alignment of subsequent entries. There was a pattern, slight irregularities carefully dispersed among regular notation, creating a lattice of normalcy while subtly indicating attentive oversight. In East Whitford, such sophistication of record-keeping was both admirable and potentially misleading, a delicate performance of moral and social competence. He allowed his eyes to linger on the ledger. Marginal notes referenced payments and subscriptions, yet certain entries seemed almost deliberately opaque, employing abbreviations or symbols whose meaning might be obvious only to the writer. Purbright considered the possibility. Someone might be signaling to a sympathetic observer, quietly communicating knowledge that could alter reputations or influence future inquiry. A faint sound, barely perceptible, drew his attention. A soft rustle from the window ledge where a stack of correspondence rested. He glanced up to find the housekeeper arranging envelopes, yet her movements carried a deliberate slowness, a careful precision that suggested awareness beyond mere housekeeping. Even the smallest gesture, Purbright knew, could serve as both concealment and revelation. "Inspector," the vicar said, breaking the silence, "I trust that no errors in the ledger will cause undue concern. East Whitford is a community sensitive to suggestion, and even a minor misalignment can ripple through perception." His gaze flicked to the marginal notes, the folded scrap, the minor irregularities, each carefully observed yet politely unremarked upon. Purbright inclined his head, considering both the ledger and the silent gestures of those around it. "Perception," he said quietly, "is often more significant than fact. A ledger, while numerical, reflects the moral economy of a community. What is recorded and what is left unrecorded can be as telling as any confession." The vicar nodded, a faint flush of acknowledgement colouring his cheeks. He returned to arranging papers, each movement deliberate, methodical, yet subtly charged with the anxiety of one aware that every minor irregularity might be scrutinised. Purbright, with a measured glance at the ledger, made a subtle note of the creased page, the folded message, and the pattern of annotation. None were conclusive, yet each hinted at intention, consciousness, and perhaps concealment. Small gestures in a village such as this carried weight. The crease of a page, the placement of a note, the manner of recording a sum. Each could reveal more than any statement or explanation. As he prepared to depart, the housekeeper's hand lingered briefly on the edge of the desk, adjusting a sheet as if ensuring that nothing would escape observation. The footman paused in the doorway, posture taut, but expression neutral. The vicar returned to his correspondence, meticulous and anxious. Purbright stepped into the faint light outside, the village streets quiet beneath the soft drizzle. In his pocket, the folded note rested, a subtle clue in the web of propriety and observation. The ledger, though outwardly perfect, had begun to reveal its fractures, minor irregularities, deliberate annotations, and the quiet interplay of conscience and calculation. In East Whitford, he reflected, a document need not vanish to influence events. The absence of oversight, the misalignment of figures, and the carefully folded scraps all whispered of intent. And somewhere, within the lattice of propriety, a signal awaited recognition, a small, almost imperceptible suggestion of knowledge, waiting for the proper eye to perceive it. Purbright walked on, quiet and deliberate, the soft rhythm of his steps matching the understated tension of a village in which the smallest discrepancies might illuminate the most important truths. The parish ledger, he realized with restrained amusement, was now as significant a witness as any living observer, and it had begun to speak in whispers. The afternoon sun slanted through the high windows of the church vestry, falling on the worn wooden benches and the neatly stacked hymnals with a quiet, impartial light. Inspector Purbright arrived to observe a routine meeting of parish representatives, though the promise of routine in East Whitford was rarely literal. The vestry, modest yet meticulously ordered, seemed almost designed to render social hierarchies visible. The seating, the arrangement of registers, even the placement of hymnals reflected an unspoken order of precedence. The vicar was already present, seated near the small desk by the window, his fingers lightly resting on a stack of correspondence. His posture was composed, yet his eyes betrayed a subtle vigilance, as though he anticipated the intrusion of observation in every minor exchange. Purbright noted the faint crease at the corner of one letter, a detail suggesting either careful concealment or habitual attentiveness. "Inspector Purbright," said the vicar, inclining his head with polite gravity. "I trust the morning has been agreeable. We are prepared for a brief discussion of parish matters, and I hope it will not overtax your time." His voice carried the civility of routine, tempered by a faint undercurrent of concern. Purbright allowed a mild smile. "I am here to observe, not to disrupt. Even the quietest meeting can reveal much about human intention and oversight." His words, though gentle, contained a subtle invitation that the ordinary gestures of propriety could speak volumes to a careful observer. Soon a small group of committee members entered, each presenting a studied neutrality. Mrs. Pendlebury, her hands folded precisely in front of her, seated herself with careful deliberation, glancing occasionally at the vicar. Mr. Carraway, the treasurer, adjusted his spectacles and nodded to Purbright, as if to indicate both awareness and deference. Each movement was measured, each gesture quietly observed by the others, a choreography of civility and vigilance. Miss Langley, the choir director, was present as well, carrying a bundle of hymnals and papers. She placed them carefully on a side bench, ensuring alignment and order, then lifted her gaze briefly toward Purbright. Her eyes suggested an awareness of observation and a mild curiosity as to how it might interpret her performance. The vicar opened the discussion with customary politeness. "We must review recent contributions and consider scheduling for upcoming events. Additionally, any matters arising from parish correspondence should be noted." His tone was formal, yet he lingered slightly on the phrase "matters arising," suggesting a cautious acknowledgement of the recent incident with the missing confession. Purbright's attention drifted to the subtle interactions among the committee members. Mrs. Pendlebury's hand brushed lightly against the edge of the desk near a folded note, pausing as though uncertain whether to adjust it or leave it untouched. Mr. Carraway's eyes shifted toward the same note, but only briefly, masking his interest beneath an air of polite attentiveness. Even in silence, Purbright observed a conversation unfolding without words, a negotiation of knowledge, attention, and propriety. The vicar, apparently unaware of the inspector's scrutiny, addressed a minor procedural matter, a misalignment of contributions recorded in the ledger. "It appears," he said softly, "that certain subscriptions have been entered with slight variation. I trust the committee will interpret this as an inadvertent error rather than deliberate misrepresentation." His phrasing, careful and formal, contained both explanation and subtle self-protection. Mrs. Pendlebury inclined her head with the faintest air of disapproval. "Of course, Vicar, one must maintain both accuracy and perception. Even minor lapses can ripple through the community." Her tone was polite, but carried the unmistakable weight of judgment, suggesting that she observed more than she revealed. Miss Langley, as if to redirect attention, remarked gently on scheduling. "The upcoming rehearsals may require adjustment, though I believe the parishioners will respond with customary diligence." Her eyes briefly flicked toward the folded note, and Purbright noted a slight stiffening in her posture, as though the mere presence of the paper held unspoken significance. During a lull, Purbright allowed himself to observe the minutiae, the crease in the folded note, the faint indentation of writing, slight hesitation in gestures as committee members adjusted hymnals or notes. Even ordinary activity, shifting a chair, turning a page, was freighted with caution, a testament to the pervasive influence of social scrutiny in East Whitford. A soft cough drew his attention. Edward, the footman, had quietly entered to remove tea trays left from a previous gathering. His posture was impeccable, his eyes flicking briefly toward the folded note before he moved to the sideboard. He did not speak, yet his small, careful movements suggested both obedience and an awareness of significance beyond ordinary domestic routine. Purbright allowed the pause to extend. "The distribution of correspondence," he observed, "often tells as much about social dynamics as the contents themselves. One might note which letters are handled quickly, which are lingered upon, and which are set aside entirely." His words, delivered casually, prompted the faintest adjustments among the committee, subtle corrections in posture or attention that betrayed minor awareness of implied observation. Mrs. Pendlebury, aligning her papers with precise care, allowed a slight hesitation over the folded note. Purbright's gaze met hers, and in that moment the silence carried meaning, a question of recognition, a measure of discretion, and perhaps a quiet acknowledgment of what had been witnessed or withheld. The vicar, sensing the gentle tension in the room, interjected with formal composure. "If there are no further matters, we may adjourn shortly. Yet I would ask all present to consider carefully the importance of diligence in recording both events and observations. Accuracy, after all, is both a moral and practical obligation." His phrasing, deliberate and measured, seemed to acknowledge the presence of the inspector as a subtle arbiter of propriety. Purbright allowed a quiet smile, noting the slight stiffening of several hands, the careful alignment of papers, and the muted, polite glances exchanged among the committee. Each movement, each hesitation, was a minor testament to the social web into which the missing confession had quietly intruded. As the meeting drew to a close, Mrs. Pendlebury collected her papers, pausing over the folded note. She lingered briefly, adjusting its placement ever so slightly, before retreating as if uncertain whether it should be concealed or revealed. Purbright's attention caught the faintest quiver in her fingers, a minor signal, almost imperceptible, yet suggestive of awareness and intention. Edward, departing with the last of the trays, offered a nod to Purbright, eyes momentarily scanning the vestry desk before he left. The vicar gathered his correspondence, smoothing each sheet with careful diligence. The committee members rose in orderly fashion, exchanging polite farewells and subtle gestures that reinforced social hierarchy while masking private concern. Purbright allowed himself a final observation. The folded note, resting among otherwise routine documents, had become a nexus of attention, a minor clue, silent yet resonant, indicating that someone had noticed, manipulated, or acknowledged knowledge of the missing confession without declaration. In East Whitford, where propriety governed both speech and gesture, such minutiae often conveyed more than explicit testimony. Stepping into the late afternoon light, Purbright reflected on the lattice of observation he had witnessed. The vestry, though outwardly calm, had revealed a series of quiet interactions, subtle adjustments, and the faint tremor of reputational anxiety. The missing confession note had not reappeared, yet its influence had begun to ripple outward, shaping gestures, glances, and unspoken communication. As he walked along the damp, cobbled streets, the inspector's thoughts lingered on the folded note, the fleeting recognition in Mrs. Pendlebury's movements, and the footman's precise yet watchful comportment. Somewhere within these understated gestures lay the beginnings of understanding, a minor behavioral clue, a subtle admission, and a question as silent as it was significant. Purbright allowed himself a quiet, dry amusement. In East Whitford, the loudest disturbances were rarely audible, and the smallest signals, folded paper, a hand's hesitation, a glance held too long, were often the most telling. The confession had vanished, yet its echo had already begun to speak, and the inspector, as ever, would listen carefully. The village square was hushed in the late afternoon, damp cobbles glistening under a pale, diffused light. Inspector Purbright walked slowly, observing the subtle choreography of social interaction, the brief nods of acknowledgement, the precise avoidance of eye contact, the measured steps taken to maintain both distance and civility. In East Whitford, gossip was a currency as vital as coin, yet it was traded in whispers, half-smiles, and the faintest arch of an eyebrow. Purbright's first stop was the post office, a small, tidy room in which Mrs. Colchester presided over letters and parcels with both diligence and discretion. She greeted him with restrained warmth. "Inspector, I hope your day proceeds agreeably. Nothing of interest has arrived, at least nothing unusual." Her choice of phrasing, carefully measured, carried a faintly defensive edge. Even in reporting the mundane, East Whitford citizens seemed acutely aware of subtle implications. "Thank you, Mrs. Colchester," Purbright replied lightly. Though one finds in villages that the ordinary often contains the most revealing details. His words prompted a faint pause, the kind that hinted at knowledge not spoken aloud. The postmistress's hand lingered over the counter, a small hesitation betraying that her habitual discretion included the careful selection of silence. Purbright stepped outside, allowing the quiet hum of the village to carry observations in its subtle way. He noticed Mrs. Pendlebury arranging flowers in her window box. Her movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, yet the slightest flicker of attention, glancing toward the vicarage, suggested a mind half occupied with the affairs of others. Each villager, he noted, performed civility as much as they performed observation. A glance or a gesture might betray the most significant insight if one was attuned to the rhythms of reputation. The butcher's apprentice, polishing the counter through the shop window, offered a quick nod, eyes briefly reflecting curiosity and mild apprehension. Purbright smiled inwardly. Even in this routine gesture there was awareness of hierarchy and observation. Nothing was truly casual in East Whitford. Every acknowledgement carried weight. He made his way toward the small alley behind the square, a narrow corridor often used for discreet conversation. Here the whispers of parish gossip travelled unobserved by the more formal eye. A muffled discussion floated from the corner where Mrs. Fenton and her neighbour, Miss Ralston, leaned together. Their voices were low, polite, yet each phrase seemed layered with subtle implication. "Did you hear about the vicar's ledger?" Mrs. Fenton murmured, her tone casual, though Purbright detected the faint tension in her voice. "I heard it was adjusted slightly, nothing improper, of course, but one wonders what is preserved and what is overlooked." Miss Ralston inclined her head, adjusting her gloves. "I believe discretion is preserved by many, but not all are equally diligent. One must observe carefully whom one trusts with even the smallest knowledge." She glanced toward the vicarage, a movement almost imperceptible, yet rich with meaning. Purbright noted the choice of words. Preserved, overlooked, trust. Terms deliberately neutral, yet heavily laden with suggestion. Even casual conversation in East Whitford was often a controlled negotiation of moral and social authority. He allowed them to speak without interruption, listening with the subtle patience that had long served him well. The murmur of gossip, though ostensibly trivial, provided a map of attention and concern. References to the ledger, to minor discrepancies, to the missing note, and to the conduct of parishioners were woven into a lattice of implied observation. Each whisper suggested awareness, complicity, or speculation. Passing the vestry window, Purbright noticed a figure inside, adjusting hymnals with meticulous care. Miss Langley, as always, maintained precise attention to her role, yet her glance toward the window suggested acknowledgement of being observed. Even the most disciplined performance could not wholly conceal awareness of scrutiny. Purbright paused at the edge of a shadowed corner near the vicarage gates. Here, subtle details revealed themselves more clearly: the alignment of hedges and fences, the careful placement of a broom or flower pot, the trajectory of pedestrian movement. Each minor displacement, each hesitation in step or glance, carried significance within the network of village observation. A soft rustle drew his attention to a scrap of paper lodged beneath a loose paving stone. He lifted it discreetly. A note, hastily folded and only partially legible, contained a few words implying awareness of the ledger's minor irregularities. Its anonymous authorship, deliberate concealment, and strategic placement suggested careful calculation. Whoever had left it intended for it to be discovered, or at least considered, without revealing themselves. Purbright studied the scrap, noting the careful, almost apologetic phrasing. There was no accusation, merely suggestion, a silent signal that someone had observed, interpreted, and acted upon knowledge without disrupting appearances. In East Whitford, he reflected, the quietest interventions often carried the greatest influence. He returned the note to the shadowed corner, observing the nearby gatekeeper, a woman of precise routine. Her attention, though outwardly directed elsewhere, lingered fractionally on the area where he had found the scrap. A subtle tilt of her head, a brief adjustment of her gloves, small gestures, but suggestive of awareness. Purbright filed the observation, noting that even peripheral figures could participate in the transmission of knowledge. Walking toward the high street, he noted Mr. Carraway's careful pacing along the shop fronts. The treasurer's hands were clasped behind his back, posture exact, yet the occasional flicker of eye contact toward the vestry and the vicarage betrayed curiosity, perhaps unease. Purbright smiled faintly to himself. In East Whitford, curiosity and propriety were often inseparable companions. A group of children played near the fountain, their voices muted under the shadow of adult expectation. Even in their innocent energy, patterns of observation emerged, a glance toward an adult, a pause in laughter at the sight of a familiar face, the alignment of movements to social expectation. Purbright allowed himself the dry amusement that even youthful play could serve as a mirror of propriety and restraint. By the time he returned to the vicarage, the light had softened into late afternoon, washing the streets in a faint, diffused gold. Inside, the housekeeper arranged the tea service with her usual precision, while Edward, the footman, lingered near the doorway, posture taut, yet eyes faintly alert. The domestic rhythm, though outwardly routine, now carried the subtle echo of observation and minor anxiety he had traced throughout the village. Purbright allowed a quiet moment to absorb the interplay. Gossip, gesture, careful scrutiny, and understated correction formed a lattice of knowledge, suspicion, and social calculation. The missing confession note had not reappeared, yet its absence influenced every movement, every glance, every carefully phrased remark. As he prepared to depart, Purbright's gaze returned to the shadowed corner in the square, faintly illuminated by the waning light. The scrap of paper and the deliberate ambiguity of its placement suggested intention, a message, a warning, or perhaps simply the subtle assertion of awareness. In East Whitford, he reflected, such gestures were more revealing than overt statements, more potent than argument, and infinitely more difficult to interpret. Walking along the cobbled street toward the vicarage gates, Purbright noted the small cues, a door closed a fraction too deliberately, the alignment of curtains in a window, the faint shift of a foot on the step. Each tiny movement was imbued with silent meaning, a suggestion of attention, awareness, or cautious complicity. The inspector allowed a faint, dry smile. The village's social lattice had begun to reveal fractures and alignments he had previously overlooked. Gossip, though subtle and often indirect, had provided both map and compass, guiding him toward the latent signals embedded in gesture and document. And somewhere, amid these polite and measured interactions, lay the next clue, small, deliberate, and waiting for recognition. With the late afternoon sun waning, Purbright walked on, carrying both observation and quiet amusement. The lattice of attention, the whispered calculations of propriety, and the subtle signals of suspicion had begun to coalesce, hinting at the careful orchestration underlying East Whitford's outward calm. And the folded notes, the scrapes of paper, and the shadowed gestures promised that in time even the most discreet revelations would find their proper audience. The day had slipped into a muted evening, the village streets cast in the soft glow of gas lamps, their light reflected on the damp cobbles. Inspector Purbright approached the modest house of Mrs. Pendlebury, invited to observe what the hostess had delicately described as a gathering of a few friends for a quiet discussion of parish affairs. In East Whitford, such invitations were rarely casual, and the phrase itself suggested both civility and subtle oversight. Mrs. Pendlebury greeted him at the door, gloved hands extended with careful formality. "Inspector," she said, voice steady, eyes flicking briefly toward the parlour where the other guests awaited. "I trust your day has been agreeable?" "Most agreeable, thank you," Purbright replied, allowing a faint smile. "I understand this is a small gathering, yet I suspect even small gatherings can reveal much." His words, as always, carried the quietest of ironies, acknowledging that observation could illuminate more than conversation. The parlour was arranged with meticulous precision, chairs spaced for polite conversation, teacups aligned on trays, and a faint scent of lavender masking the earthy undertones of the evening chill. Mrs. Fenton and Miss Ralston were present, seated with impeccable posture, their Glances carefully regulated, their hands arranged to convey calm authority. Even the youngest member, a recent parishioner, displayed a cautious attentiveness as though conscious of the invisible hierarchy. "I thought," Mrs. Pendlebury began, "we might discuss the recent committee activities, though I do not wish to intrude upon your observations, Inspector." Her phrasing suggested deference while subtly establishing control, a delicate balance of hospitality and influence. Purbright inclined his head. "I am here merely to observe. Yet one finds that even routine discussions of accounts, contributions, or musical matters can reveal intentions more readily than direct questioning." The conversation unfolded in measured tones, each speaker choosing words with care. Mrs. Fenton commented on recent choir activities, praising Miss Langley's diligence, though a faint hesitation in phrasing suggested lingering critique. Miss Ralston mentioned scheduling, her statements precise, neutral, yet carefully constructed to assert subtle authority without overt confrontation. The vicar arrived shortly after, greeting each attendee with formal politeness, his eyes briefly scanning the room before settling on the inspector. He took a seat near the fireplace, adjusting his spectacles and smoothing his jacket, displaying both habitual composure and an undercurrent of anxiety. Even in social ritual, Purbright noted, one could detect the faint tremors of conscience or concern. Tea was served, and the conversation shifted to parish finances. Mr. Carraway, the treasurer, spoke with deliberate accuracy, reporting minor discrepancies and late contributions. Each statement was careful, polite, and precise, yet Purbright observed subtle signs of tension, a hand brushing the edge of a ledger, eyes briefly avoiding direct contact, lips pressing together before speaking. In East Whitford, such minute gestures often conveyed more than words. Mrs. Pendlebury leaned slightly forward, voice lowered. "Of course, one must always consider the perception of propriety. Even small errors can ripple unexpectedly." Her gaze briefly rested on the vicar, then on Purbright, an almost imperceptible acknowledgement of shared awareness. Purbright's attention drifted to the small details, a misplaced bookmark in the ledger, the faint indentation of a pencil note, a crease in a folded piece of paper left beside the tea tray. These subtle indicators, trivial to most, carried layered meaning within the careful lattice of observation that governed the village. Miss Langley adjusted a chair slightly closer to the fireplace, hands resting lightly on her lap. Purbright noted the brief flicker of her eyes toward the ledger, an acknowledgement of its importance even in a social setting. The vicar, sensing attention, cleared his throat softly. "I trust all matters remain in capable hands," he said, voice calm yet carrying a shade of concern that betrayed more than he intended. The discussion continued. Purbright allowed the silence between remarks to speak. Glances were exchanged, minor hesitations occurred, and the subtle alignment of hands and papers revealed layers of scrutiny and awareness. Even the most polite phrases contained embedded judgments, a compliment weighed against suspicion, a question framed in civility masking subtle inquiry. At one point a soft rustle drew Purbright's attention. Edward, the footman, entered with a tray of additional tea, moving with impeccable control, yet betraying the faintest awareness in the lift of his gaze toward the ledger. His presence, though ostensibly functional, punctuated the room with silent observation, a reminder that the hierarchy of attention extended beyond the visible participants. A folded scrap of paper, partially concealed beneath a teacup, caught Purbright's eye. He allowed a brief glance at it without comment. Faint handwriting suggested recent notation regarding contributions, though its placement seemed intended for selective discovery. Mrs. Fenton's hand hovered near the teacup as she reached for it, then withdrew, a subtle hesitation that suggested awareness of its significance. The vicar spoke again, gently reminding the group of upcoming committee reviews. "Accuracy, diligence, and discretion remain our guiding principles," he said. His words, formal and measured, carried a quiet weight. Even in social ritual, moral and reputational expectations were ever present. Purbright allowed himself a dry, inward smile. The interactions were a dance of civility and attention, subtle confrontations embedded within ordinary conversation. Every phrase, every glance, every careful movement contributed to a tapestry of observation, loyalty, and minor anxiety. As the gathering drew to a close, Mrs. Pendlebury thanked the guests with polite gravity. Chairs were adjusted, papers collected, and teacups replaced on trays with geometric precision. Each departure was accompanied by a measured exchange of words, the faintest hint of judgment or acknowledgment underlying each gesture. Purbright rose to leave, noting the minor signals. The vicar's hand resting briefly on the ledger, Miss Langley's controlled posture, Mrs. Fenton's subtle glance toward the concealed scrap of paper. These minor cues, combined with earlier observations of the ledger and village gossip, suggested that the knowledge of the missing confession note had begun to circulate quietly, selectively, and without declaration. Outside, the evening was cool and faintly misted. Purbright walked along the cobbled street, noting the alignment of shutters, the careful closure of doors, and the occasional flicker of curtains betraying observation from within. In East Whitford, even the smallest gestures contained meaning, and every citizen performed propriety with the awareness of surveillance both real and implied. He allowed a quiet reflection. The confession note had not reappeared, yet its influence rippled through social interactions, minor hesitations, and the meticulous performance of civility. The evening gathering, though outwardly calm, had revealed fissures in attention, subtle acknowledgments of knowledge, and the faintest assertions of discretion. A final glance toward the vicarage revealed Edward lingering near the doorway, posture taut but eyes alert. Purbright noted the faintest arch of his brow, the almost imperceptible shift in stance, a signal that some awareness had passed between observer and observed without declaration. Even routine gestures carried meaning in a village governed by reputation, propriety, and quiet calculation. With measured steps, Purbright walked onward, the evening mist curling softly about the cobbles. The lattice of observation, small signals, and understated confrontation had begun to coalesce. Minor gestures now suggested intention, hesitations implied recognition, and silent questions hovered over every exchange. The missing confession note remained absent, yet its shadow was increasingly apparent, insinuating itself into conversation, observation, and social expectation. In the quiet of the village evening, Purbright allowed himself a faint, dry amusement. Here, in East Whitford, the most consequential truths were often hidden within civility, and the smallest gestures carried the heaviest implications. And somewhere, in the careful balance of observation and discretion, the next clue awaited, subtle, deliberate, and poised to speak in silence. The vicarage was unusually quiet that evening, the only illumination provided by a pair of slender candles whose wavering light lent a delicate chiaroscuro to the walls lined with books and hymnals. Inspector Purbright had arrived with deliberate timing, wishing to observe the household and parish documents under conditions where shadow and reflection might reveal what daylight concealed. The village had settled into its habitual calm, yet the air was thick with anticipation, as if propriety itself had become taut with expectation. The vicar received him in the study with customary civility, though his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the candles on the desk. "Inspector," he said softly, "the evening is quiet, yet I cannot deny a faint sense of apprehension regarding the parish records." His voice, though calm, carried the subtle tremor of one who feared observation even in routine ritual. Purbright inclined his head. Apprehension is often a sign of awareness, Vicar, and in East Whitford, awareness can be more revealing than overt confession. His tone was measured, dry, and yet somehow lightly amused, as though acknowledging the gentle ironies inherent in village propriety. The desk was arranged meticulously, ledgers aligned, papers stacked in precise order, and the candlelight reflecting faintly off polished surfaces. Purbright's gaze swept across the room, noting small irregularities. The slight curl of a page corner, a marginal pencil note almost entirely erased, and the subtle impression of a hand that had held a document recently but deliberately withdrawn. In East Whitford, such minutiae were often the loudest signals. Mrs. Fenton entered quietly, bearing a tray of tea, and placed it with measured precision on a side table. Her glance lingered on the ledger and the faintly creased document at the edge of the desk. She smiled politely, yet her hand trembled almost imperceptibly as she adjusted the teacup. Purbright's attention lingered on this minor gesture, anxiety, awareness, or perhaps a signal unspoken. Miss Langley followed, adjusting the folds of her gloves, and positioned herself near the fireplace. She did not speak, yet the faint arch of her brow and the subtle tension in her shoulders suggested that she, too, had registered the significance of the evening and the documents before him. In East Whitford, silence often carried as much weight as speech, particularly when layered with social expectation. Purbright turned his attention to the ledger itself. He opened it slowly, running a finger along the entries, noting the careful penmanship and the slight variations that marked human intervention. It was here, he reflected, that the parish's moral economy intersected with numerical record. Minor irregularities previously tolerated as clerical quirks now revealed intention, deliberate or inadvertent. It was difficult to tell, yet their cumulative effect was subtle, significant, and suggestive. The vicar, observing him closely, murmured, "I hope all appears in order, Inspector. I have attempted to maintain both propriety and accuracy, though one never knows what might be discovered upon closer inspection." His words were formal, yet the slight falter betrayed concern. Even routine honesty in East Whitford carried the burden of social scrutiny. As Purbright studied the ledger, his gaze fell upon a faintly folded scrap of paper, tucked between two pages. The handwriting was careful but hurried, the message partially obscured by the fold. He lifted it gently, observing the note without immediate disclosure. It referenced minor adjustments to contributions, yet the phrasing suggested awareness of oversight, or perhaps deliberate concealment. Mrs. Fenton's eyes, previously cast downward as she polished the edge of the tray, flickered momentarily toward the note. She paused, then resumed her task with only the faintest hesitation, a gesture so subtle that a casual observer might miss it entirely. Purbright noted it quietly, a minor but meaningful acknowledgement of recognition. Miss Langley, meanwhile, adjusted the angle of a candle to reduce glare, yet her gaze tracked the same corner of the desk as if following the invisible thread of awareness connecting the ledger, the note, and the present assembly. Even minor corrections in posture and gesture, Purbright reflected, often carried unspoken communication in villages of careful propriety. The vicar cleared his throat softly, returning his attention to his letters. "I trust that any discrepancies in the ledger are now sufficiently accounted for," he said, voice calm yet precise, as if to reassure himself as much as the inspector. The phrasing implied concern over observation, a quiet appeal to both authority and discretion. Purbright allowed a silence to settle, observing the minor interplay of gestures and attention. Each hand movement, glance, and pause contributed to an understated network of acknowledgement, a lattice of awareness that revealed more than any formal declaration. Even the subtle tremor in Mrs. Fenton's hand, the adjustment of Miss Langley's posture, and the flick of the vicar's eyes over the ledger were threads in a web of observation carefully performed and delicately concealed. Then, as he gently unfolded the scrap of paper, he noticed something previously overlooked, a faint fingerprint at the corner of the fold. Its placement was inconsequential for ordinary handling, yet in the quiet logic of East Whitford it suggested intentional placement. The note had not been left carelessly. It had been deliberately positioned to convey, obscure, and provoke recognition, all without overt declaration. Purbright's eyes lifted slowly to the assembled figures. Each displayed their habitual composure, yet the subtle cues of acknowledgement, fleeting attention, and quiet calculation were now sharper, more deliberate. Even in silence, they participated in the drama of propriety, reputation, and discreet awareness. "Inspector," the vicar murmured, "I hope the evening has not been unduly burdensome. It is a particular pleasure to host such attention with civility intact." His phrasing, delicate and carefully neutral, betrayed only the faintest undercurrent of concern for both moral and social propriety. Purbright inclined his head, glancing once more at the folded note and the faint fingerprint. "The evening, Vicar, has been illuminating. One finds that even the quietest gestures, the smallest folds of paper, and the most measured silences carry meaning in East Whitford. Truth, after all, is often spoken in nuance rather than declaration." Mrs. Fenton adjusted the teacup ever so slightly. Miss Langley shifted her posture with minimal but notable precision, and the vicar smoothed the edge of the ledger. Each movement was subtle, polite, and restrained, yet collectively they hinted at awareness, perhaps even complicity, regarding the missing confession note. Purbright replaced the scrap within the ledger carefully, ensuring no outward disruption. The note, its placement, and the accompanying gestures now formed a pattern of acknowledgement and discretion, a signal left for recognition without overt statement, a delicate assertion that knowledge had passed, if only quietly. As he rose to depart, the candlelight flickered across the room, highlighting the creases of paper, the folds of hands, and the faint tensions of posture. The inspector allowed a soft, dry smile. The confession had vanished, yet its influence had rippled through gesture, document, and subtle attention. Even in absence, it had begun to speak. Walking into the misted village evening, Purbright reflected that the lattice of civility, observation, and minor deception had never been clearer. Every gesture, every hesitation, and every carefully managed glance carried latent information. Somewhere within these quiet signals lay the first solid trace of intention, the fingerprint on the note, the deliberate fold, and the silent recognition of its presence. In East Whitford, he thought, truth was seldom announced. It arrived in creased paper, in gestures too small to notice at a glance, in the quiet acknowledgement of awareness. And tonight, in the candle-lit study, it had whispered its first deliberate clue.